This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
A pastor who understands the importance of Genesis 6. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. Yes, there are some out there, and we are blessed to have one with us this evening. He is the pastor at... bring up my notes here. Gulf Shores Church of Christ in Gulf Shores, Alabama. He has put out a book. The cover and the title caught our attention. Josh Peck, of course, scored an earlier interview with him and sent me a private note and said, you definitely need to speak to this guy because he's right on target. He's the author of a new book called Gospel Over Gods, and it's our honor to welcome to the program for the first time, Tyler Gilreath. Tyler, welcome.
Derek, thank you so much, man, for the invitation. I've been looking forward to getting on here with you since Josh, kind of told me about you guys. And man, I love your work. I love the books you guys are putting out. And I just can't say enough, about trying to bring on the forefront, on the front line, to our churches, the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And, what we're talking about today is pretty foreign, to most modern Christians. And so, we're trying to kind of accomplish the same thing. We're trying to get the message of spiritual warfare out there and how it ties into the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I appreciate the invitation to be on the program today.
The subtitle, Jesus Christ, the Fallen Angels and the Supernatural War of the Bible, doesn't really alert the reader that you dive into the Genesis 6 account, of course, which describes the creation of the giants by these sons of God who saw that the daughters of men were fair. And that's a topic that most pastors don't touch. Most churchgoers have never heard. I was in my mid-30s before I heard anybody, an evangelist, preach on Genesis 6 and say, yeah, this is exactly what it means. And for me, that was like a slap in the, like a board to the side of my head. Like, what? Because I've always been interested in things that are a little odd. And maybe I inherited this from my dad, who was an engineer. He always wanted to figure out how things worked. And so I immediately went to the library. The local library branch had, I think, 2 books on the Nephilim. One was a young adult novel by Frank Peretti. The other was L.A. Marzulli's novel called Nephilim. So I blame Marzulli for getting me into all of this. But while that was sort of like the entry point, when you begin to understand the importance that those giants and their progenitors, the fallen angels, the watchers, the importance that they've had, that was really an inflection point in history. And yet it is not taught by probably 95% of the pastors working today. Maybe that's even a generous number. Tyler,
Yeah.
What was it about this topic that drew your attention, and why did you decide to pursue research into it and write a book about it?
It kind of came out of left field for me. I had a guy here at my congregation who said, you need to check some material out. And so, he let me read, I think it was Reversing Hermon was the first book I was introduced to that talked about this stuff. And, I grew up in a great Christian family, had a great foundation. And, I'm studying and I'm reading. I went to Bible college, and no one had ever mentioned, the supernatural interpretation of Genesis 6, 1-4. And so here I am, I'm kind of leading a congregation, and I'm coming across this material for the very first time that was pretty mind blowing. And so, I did the only thing I knew to do, and that's dive into the text deeper. And so that kind of sent me down a rabbit trail that I would say changed my life. It changed my walk. It changed my approach to ministry. And I just began to dig into study. And I studied everything I could get my hands on. And once I began to see that this was much bigger than just 4 verses, I began to make some notes. I began to do more research, and I began to see this thread that was interwoven throughout the tapestry of Scripture. And I felt like I needed to put this together. I needed to put this material together. Not that no one has ever done it before, but I needed to put it together in a narrative form. And so I wrote my book where the reader can be immersed into the supernatural war of the Bible itself, into the story itself. And there's a lot of material out there. You have a lot of great material as well that is, dives into this material very, very deep. But at least from my study, I was looking for something, some book, some material out there that told the story from A to Z. And I had a hard time locating exactly that. And so I felt like there was a need to tell the story of the great rebellions that we find in the Bible. And so that was my goal. That was my intent with the material. It was to not to just, introduce the reader to the supernatural worldview of the Bible, but to immerse them into the war itself. And so each chapter has a reading the story section, which really reads like a narrative, like a story. And it usually, uses mostly, scripture to tell that story. There's some other ancient testimonies that kind of shore that up. But each chapter has that feature in it, which is, kind of unique. And then there's some answering your questions sections, connecting the gospel, which I thought was important because I wanted people to see that, as you read the story, as you immerse yourself into the story, you see all these gospel connections which show up, later on in the gospel, but they connect back, to the Old Testament. So I wanted, a chance to tell the readers the story. And that's really why I wrote this book.
Most pastors come out of seminary with the understanding that Genesis 6, the sons of God in those verses are the righteous sons of Seth. Your research, I'm sure, has led you to the same conclusion that we have, that this was not the understanding of the early church. What was it that convinced you that the plain reading of Genesis 6, that the sons of God were actually supernatural entities and not the physical linear descendants of Seth?
So a couple things convinced me. One was the context of the Bible itself. The B'nai Ha-Elohim of the Old Testament, if you look in Job 1, Job 2, and Job 38, it's very clear that those B'nai Ha-Elohim, or those sons of God, are angelic beings. It's even clearer when you look into the Septuagint, because the Septuagint just spells it out. It translates that as the angels of God. So that was very interesting. And so, you plug that ancient context, that ancient interpretation into Genesis 1 or Genesis 6 rather. And then you say, okay, well, if it meant angels of God here, then why should it mean angels of God here in Genesis 6? And so, even in the Septuagint, you do get that rendering. You do get angels of God in Genesis 6 in the Septuagint. But one of the first things that caught my attention was, the testimonies of great men such as Josephus, where, Josephus and the Antiquities of the Jews, says, for many angels of God accompanied with women and begot sons. These men did that which resembled the acts whom the Grecians called giants. And so I had always, studied Josephus, professors I had in school talked very highly of Josephus. I have all of his, his works. And so it really hit me between the eyes when I saw that even Josephus, understood that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were the angels of God and their Nephilim were the giants. Okay. And so then I said, well, are there others in antiquity that, understood these sons of God to be angels of God? And I was pretty blown away with the fact that, pretty much all of the early Christians interpreted it this way. For example, you have Irenaeus. Irenaeus lived between 130 and 203 AD, and he was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of the Apostle John.
Mm-hmm,
okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's a very close connection to an apostle. And here's what he wrote. Irenaeus wrote that an illicit union took place on the earth since the angels were united with the daughters of the race of mankind, and they bore to them sons who for their exceeding greatness were called giants. Okay. So there is a man that lived in and around the time of the apostles, who pretty much just came out and said, no, yeah, those sons of God in Genesis 6 are the angels of God. And so, there was an array of testimonies that came out in my studies, men, such as Irenaeus, men such as Athenagoras, men such as Justin Martyr, who said, but the angels transgressed this appointment and were captivated by the love of women. And so, I just kept digging and kept digging and kept digging. And what I found was, up until about the 4th century, Derek, the early Christians understood, like the ancient Jews, that the sons of God were the angels of God. And so it was pretty disturbing to me. Here I was, someone that tried to be, all about the Bible and try to restore the ancient context of the Bible. And I was totally clueless about what that ancient context was. So
how does this change our understanding then of this long spiritual war? What does it mean to us Christians that those sons of God in Genesis 6 were supernatural and not that there's not a natural explanation for what the Bible very briefly describes in Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4?
Well, I mean, it sets the tone pretty early about, the extent to which angels will go to rebel against God. And that's so key, because we are in a spiritual battle. Paul said we wrestle not with flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against these forces in the heavenly places. And so we are very much, fighting these same entities today. And so if you don't have the background story, then you're going to miss a lot of the context that Paul talks about. Okay. And we're familiar when Christ was on the scene, he was around casting out demons and doing all these things. And so the ancients would have told you, the work of Christ, of course, was to save the world from these entities, but it was also to show his power over them. And so, the ancients understood that the demons that Jesus cast out were the spirits of those giants, or the spirits of those Nephilim. And so we see that this war was not just a war that took place in one period of time, before the flood, but it was a war that would perpetuate and would continue, throughout the ancient world. And as Paul said, it's here upon our front door today. And so I'm a firm believer in that you can't understand modern spiritual warfare until you understand the ancient spiritual warfare.
Jesus did battle with the Nephilim, these demons. That was a major part of his ministry. So in a very real sense, Jesus was doing battle with the giants.
Oh, yeah, he was. It's kind of interesting. You have, the conquest of Canaan, right? Let's think about that for a minute. You have Joshua, okay, which is Yeshua, right, in Hebrew. And Yeshua is to, utterly devote to destruction these giant clans, okay? And so he's cleansing the land of this corruption. And then, so you have Jesus Christ coming on the scene, and he's also Yeshua, okay? Or Jesus in Greek, okay? He's that Joshua figure, that same name. And he's coming in, and he's also battling these same Nephilim giants, except now he's battling their spiritual form and not their physical form. And so you have that history repeating itself, if you will, in the New Testament, where Christ is doing very similar works that men like Joshua and Moses and even David did in the Old Testament, except now he's showing his power over them in the New Testament. So the giants don't go away, and I think that's what people don't realize. Number one, they don't realize their origin, okay, which is very sinister, which was forbidden. And then they don't understand how that perpetuates throughout the biblical narrative. Okay. We tend to think, well, God's just, he wakes up and he's in a bad mood, and all of a sudden he wants to kill everybody in sight. Or God is so obsessed that his children, the children of Israel, are going to live in this, zip code that he is, hell bent on killing everyone in its path, everyone that resides in the land of Canaan. It really paints God in a tyrannical way where, he's not a loving God. He doesn't love people. He doesn't love children. And so there's verses, where he's giving the karam, if you will, that the Hebrew word for devote to destruction, men, women, and children. And Derek, it's been probably a year ago. I